The roar of diesel engines tore through the dead of night, crushing 80 years of family history into splintered wood and torn earth. A massive development firm thought they were just clearing an obstacle, a stubborn, 72-year-old widow who refused to sell her family's land. They expected her to cry. They expected her to surrender. What they didn't know was that the roots they ripped from the ground held a multi-million-dollar secret, and this widow was about to harvest a vengeance that would bankrupt them all. The Willamette Valley in Oregon is known for two things: its sweeping, fog-draped agricultural beauty, and more recently, the aggressive influx of luxury real estate developers. For 72-year-old Martha Linwood, the valley was simply home. It was where she and her late husband, Arthur, had spent 45 years cultivating a masterpiece of modern agriculture on a modest 40-acre plot known as Linwood Orchards. Martha was a woman carved from the landscape itself, pragmatic, weathered by the seasons, and entirely unbothered by the rapid modernization happening around her. She lived in a cedar-shingled farmhouse that smelled perpetually of wood smoke and baking soil. But the true value of her property wasn't the house. It was the trees. Arthur Linwood hadn't just been a farmer. He was a brilliant, obsessive horticulturalist. Over 3 decades, he had painstakingly crossbred a highly specific, proprietary variety of sweet cherry. He named it the Linwood Ruby. It was a marvel of botany, resistant to the invasive spotted wing Drosophila fruit fly, frost-hardy, and possessing a complex, deeply concentrated flavor profile that high-end pastry chefs in Paris and Tokyo paid exorbitant premiums to secure. It takes 15 years for a Linwood ruby tree to reach peak maturity and yield. Martha had exactly 3,200 of these magnificent, mature trees. They were her retirement, her husband's legacy, and her life's work. Then came Oak Ridge Capital Partners. Oak Ridge was a Seattle-based private equity and development firm spearheaded by a man named Harrison Croft. Croft was a visionary in the most ruthless sense of the word. He didn't see land, he saw portfolios. Oak Ridge had recently acquired 2,000 acres surrounding Martha's farm to build the Summit at Willamette, a sprawling ultra-luxury eco-resort complete with an 18-hole championship golf course, a boutique winery, and 200 bespoke estates for tech billionaires seeking a rustic aesthetic. There was only one problem with Croft's master plan. Martha Linwood's 40-acre orchard sat dead center in the proposed footprint for the resort's grand entrance, a vital arterial road, and the clubhouse. The harassment began with polite, glossy letters. First, a standard offer of $800,000 for the land, a fair market price for empty dirt in the valley, but a laughable insult for a proprietary, high-yield agricultural operation. Martha threw it in the wood stove. Next came the phone calls, then the unannounced visits. Harrison Croft eventually sent his senior acquisitions director, a slick, impatient man named Richard Boyle. Boyle drove a spotless black Range Rover down Martha's gravel driveway, his Italian leather shoes crunching awkwardly against the mud. "Mrs. Linwood," Boyle had said, standing on her porch without an invitation, "we are offering you $2.5 million. That is 3 times the appraised value of this acreage. You can buy a beautiful condo in Portland. You can travel. You're 72. Why on earth do you want to spend your twilight years pruning trees in the freezing rain?" Martha had looked at him over the rim of her coffee mug. "Mr. Boyle, these trees are a patented genetic line. I have exclusive export contracts that run through the next decade. This isn't a hobby farm. It's a commercial research and production facility. And even if it wasn't, Arthur planted these with his own 2 hands, not for sale." Boyle's patronizing smile had slipped, revealing the corporate shark beneath. "Progress doesn't stop for sentimentality, Mrs. Linwood. We are building the Summit. We have the county zoning board in our pocket. We have the permits. You are an island in an ocean of our property. Sell now, or we will make living here entirely unbearable." "Get off my porch," Martha replied evenly. Oak Ridge Capital made good on their threat. Over the next 6 months, they waged a war of attrition. They began heavy blasting on the adjacent properties at 6 a.m., They kicked up massive clouds of dust that coated Martha's cherry blossoms, hoping to choke the harvest. They even petitioned the local water authority to reroute the irrigation canals, tying Martha up in endless, expensive municipal hearings. But Martha didn't break. She hired a local attorney, filed injunctions against their dust pollution, and installed high-definition security cameras on her barns. Oak Ridge's investors were getting anxious. The summit was hemorrhaging money and holding costs. They couldn't lay the foundational infrastructure without the Linwood plot. The project was stalled, and Harrison Croft was not a man who tolerated delays. If the legal route wouldn't work, Croft decided it was time to exploit the gray areas of the law. He knew that in real estate development, sometimes it was cheaper to ask for forgiveness than permission. In the cutthroat world of commercial development, there is a well-known, underhanded tactic referred to as strategic incompetence. When a developer is blocked by a stubborn landowner, environmental regulation, or a historic building, a contractor will sometimes make a tragic mapping error. A bulldozer will accidentally stray across a property line. An old-growth forest will be accidentally cleared. The developer acts horrified, blames the independent contractor, pays a slap-on-the-wrist civil fine to the county, and miraculously, the obstacle is gone. The land is cleared and development proceeds. Harrison Croft needed Martha's trees gone. He knew that without the orchard, she was just an old woman on a patch of empty dirt. She would lose her export contracts, her income, and her will to fight. To execute this, Oak Ridge Capital contracted Garrison Earthworks, an out-of-state excavation company, with a reputation for working fast, asking zero questions, and taking all the legal blame for a hefty premium. The foreman, Billy Garrison, was given a map that miraculously showed Martha's 40 acres as part of the Oak Ridge clearing zone. They waited for the perfect window. On the second Tuesday of October, Martha traveled to Seattle for an overnight stay to attend the Pacific Northwest Botanical Symposium, where she was delivering a keynote on pest-resistant fruit genetics. Her farmhouse was dark. The property was empty. At 1 a.m., the ground began to shake. 3 Caterpillar D8T bulldozers, massive beasts of yellow steel, weighing 40 tons each, rolled off flatbed trucks parked on the county highway. They didn't turn on their floodlights. Working by the moonlight and the glow of the dashboard instruments, the operators breached the reinforced steel gates of Linwood orchards. The destruction was systematic, brutal, and horrifyingly efficient. A D8T bulldozer doesn't need to chop a tree. It simply lowers its blade, hits the trunk, and pushes. Decades of deep root systems ripped through the topsoil with the sound of snapping bone. The machines roared, billowing thick black diesel smoke into the cold autumn air as they drove in relentless, sweeping lines. 80 years of history. 3,200 Linwood ruby cherry trees. Each one carefully pruned, grafted, and nurtured. The bulldozers snapped the trunks, ground the delicate sap-filled branches into the mud, and left behind a mangled, apocalyptic wasteland of splintered wood and overturned earth. By 4:30 a.m., the machines had reversed out of the property. The operators loaded them back onto the flatbeds and vanished down the highway. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the settling of crushed timber. Martha returned the following afternoon. As she turned her old Ford pickup onto her road, she noticed the gate was gone. Not just open, sheared off its hinges and tossed into the ditch. She stopped the truck. Her heart seized in her chest. Where there was once a lush, perfectly ordered canopy of dark green leaves and thick, sturdy trunks, there was now only devastation. The orchard looked like the site of a bomb blast. Thousands of trees lay dead, their roots exposed to the pale sun like jagged teeth. The scent of crushed cherry wood, usually sweet and fragrant, hung in the air, thick and cloying, the smell of a massacre. Martha didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stepped out of the truck, the mud soaking into her boots, and walked into the ruins of her husband's legacy. She placed a trembling, calloused hand on the splintered stump of the very first tree Arthur had ever grafted. The sap was still bleeding from the wound. She called the county sheriff. When Officer Danvers arrived, he walked the property line with a clipboard, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Linwood," Danvers said gently, avoiding her eyes. "I've spoken to the foreman over at the Oak Ridge site. They're claiming it was a GPS malfunction. The clearing crew read the coordinates wrong in the dark, because it's a property dispute and an accident by a private contractor. Well, there's no criminal intent we can prove. It's not a police matter. It's a civil issue." "A civil issue," Martha repeated, her voice eerily calm, devoid of all emotion. "They accidentally breached a locked gate and accidentally leveled 40 acres in the dead of night." "I'm sorry, ma'am. You'll have to take it up with their insurance." An hour later, a courier arrived at Martha's farmhouse with a sealed envelope bearing the Oak Ridge Capital Partners crest. Inside was a letter, signed by Harrison Croft himself. It dripped with corporate faux sympathy. "Dear Mrs. Linwood, we were devastated to learn of the catastrophic error made by our independent, earth-moving contractors. Please accept our deepest apologies for the destruction of your trees. We understand the emotional value they held. Enclosed is a check from our insurance provider for $18,500, which covers the standard lumber and firewood market value for the cleared timber, as well as an additional $5,000 for your distress. With the land now cleared, our offer of $2.5 million for the property still stands. Perhaps it is time to move on." Martha looked at the check. $18,000 for 30 years of science, love, and life. Harrison Croft thought he had broken her. He thought she was just a farmer's widow who didn't understand how the real world worked. He thought she would take the money, sell the dirt, and disappear. But Croft had made a fatal miscalculation. He had failed to research who Martha Linwood actually was. Martha didn't cash the check. She didn't call Richard Boyle to surrender. Instead, she walked into her farmhouse, made a pot of black coffee, and unlocked the heavy steel filing cabinet in Arthur's old study. What Oak Ridge Capital failed to realize was that Martha wasn't just a farmer's wife. Before she moved to the valley, she was Dr. Martha Linwood. She held a Ph.D. in agricultural sciences from Cornell University, specializing in botanical genetics and intellectual property. She knew the law, and more importantly, she knew Oregon timber law. In the state of Oregon, protecting forests and agricultural timber is taken incredibly seriously. There is a specific statute, Oregon Revised Statute, ORS 105.810, commonly known as the Timber Trespass Law. It was originally written to stop rogue logging companies from stealing wood from state lands or private owners. The law states that if someone intentionally or even recklessly cuts down, girdles, or otherwise destroys timber on another person's property without permission, the victim is entitled to triple the amount of the damages. But what were the damages? Croft's insurance had calculated the value of the trees as dead wood. Firewood. Martha picked up the phone and dialed the Portland offices of Caldwell and Wright, a boutique litigation firm known for taking on vicious corporate malpractice suits. She asked specifically for David Caldwell, a man she had consulted years ago when securing the patents for the Linwood Ruby. Caldwell drove down to the valley the next morning. When he saw the destruction, the seasoned lawyer stood in the mud, utterly speechless. "They thought they were being clever," Martha said, handing Caldwell the $18,500 check and the letter from Croft. "They used an LLC contractor. They claimed a GPS error. They want to pay me for firewood." Caldwell read the letter, his eyes narrowing. "It's a classic developer move, Martha. They isolate the liability to the contractor's insurance, eat the bad PR, and take the land. But they picked the wrong property." "I want them gutted, David," Martha said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I don't want a settlement. I want Oak Ridge Capital eradicated. Can we use the timber trespass statute?" "Oh, we're going to use it," Caldwell said, a predatory smile forming on his lips. "But we aren't valuing these as timber. We are valuing these as specialized, income-producing patented genetic assets." To build the trap, they needed absolute, irrefutable proof of what was lost. Caldwell immediately hired an elite team of independent forensic arborists and agricultural economists from Oregon State University. For 2 weeks, The team practically lived on Martha's land. They didn't just take photos, they cataloged every single stump. They measured the diameter of the root crowns. They pulled soil samples. They documented the age, health, and projected yield of all 3,200 destroyed trees. Then came the financial modeling. A standard fruit tree might cost $150 to replace, but a Linwood ruby could not be bought at a local nursery. Because Martha held the exclusive patent, the only way to replace the orchard was to graft new trees from her surviving nursery stock in the greenhouse, plant them, and wait 15 years for them to reach the maturity of the trees that were destroyed. The economists calculated the cost of propagation, soil remediation, irrigation repair, and 15 years of lost exclusive export contracts to Japan and France. The replacement cost of a single mature Linwood ruby tree was calculated not at $150, but at $8,500. Multiply that by 3,200 trees. The base damages amounted to $27,200,000. And under Oregon's timber trespass law, because the destruction was unauthorized and carried out with heavy machinery bypassing a locked gate, proving it was reckless if not intentional, that number was legally required to be tripled. $81,600,000. They don't have that, Martha said, sitting in Caldwell's office looking at the final spreadsheet. Oak Ridge Capital manages about $200 million in assets, Caldwell replied, tapping his pen. But their liquidity is entirely tied up in the Summit project. If we file this suit and attach a 8 alias pendens, a notice of pending litigation, to their surrounding properties, no bank will loan them another dime. Their investors will panic. We won't just sue them, Martha. We will freeze them to death. A month later, Harrison Croft was standing under a massive white tent on a ridge overlooking the Willamette Valley. It was the official groundbreaking ceremony for the summit at Willamette. Local politicians, wealthy investors, and real estate moguls were sipping champagne and eating catered hors d'oeuvres. Croft stepped up to the microphone, flashing his signature blinding smile. Today marks the beginning of a new era for this valley, a harmony of luxury and nature. He was interrupted by a man in a rumpled windbreaker walking briskly through the crowd. Oak Ridge security moved to intercept him, but the man was too fast. He stepped right up to the podium, completely ignoring the stunned politicians, and slapped a thick, bound stack of legal documents onto Croft's chest. "Harrison Croft, you have been served." The process server turned and walked away. Croft forced a laugh, trying to play it off for the crowd, but as he glanced down at the front page of the lawsuit, all the color instantly drained from his face. Martha Linwood versus Oak Ridge Capital Partners, LLC, Garrison Earthworks, Harrison Croft, cause of action. Timber trespass, ORS 105.810. Willful destruction of patented property. Tortious interference with international commerce. Damages sought, $81,600,000. Croft looked up from the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the valley below. In the distance, sitting on the porch of her farmhouse, overlooking the field of shattered wood, Martha Linwood was drinking her coffee, watching the tent through a pair of high-powered binoculars. And for the first time since the bulldozers arrived, she smiled. The silence that fell over the catered groundbreaking ceremony for the summit at Willamette was absolute. Harrison Croft stared at the $81 million lawsuit in his hands, the ink seeming to burn through the thick legal paper. Around him, the clinking of champagne flutes had ceased. The local politicians who had just been shaking his hand suddenly found reasons to look at their phones, quietly backing away from the podium. In the world of high-stakes real estate, litigation was common, but an $81 million personal and corporate liability claim wasn't a speed bump, it was a death sentence. Croft bypassed his waiting limousine, aggressively motioning for his senior acquisitions director, Richard Boyle, to get into the back of a black SUV. As soon as the doors slammed shut, isolating them behind soundproof glass, Croft threw the binder at Boyle's chest. "What is this, Richard?" Croft hissed, his composure entirely evaporated. "Timber trespass? Triple damages? You told me she was an old woman who grew cherries. You didn't tell me she had a doctorate from Cornell and a patent on the damn trees. Oh, Boyle fumbled with the paperwork, his slick arrogance melting into genuine panic. Harrison, it's a scare tactic. It's an inflated number designed to force a settlement. We offered her $2.5 million. She wants 5. This is just a shakedown. Our contractor, Billy Garrison, took the fall. It's his insurance problem, not ours. Does it look like a shakedown, Richard? Croft yelled, pointing out the window toward Martha's distant farmhouse. She didn't just sue Garrison. She sued Oak Ridge Capital. She sued me personally. And worse, look at page 4. Boyle flipped the pages, his hands shaking slightly. He stopped at a section highlighted in bold red ink. Notice of lis pendens. It was a Latin term that translated to suit pending. In real estate law, filing a lis pendens against a property meant there was an active legal dispute regarding the land's ownership or usage rights. Caldwell, Martha's ruthless attorney, hadn't just filed it against Martha's 40 acres. He had filed it against the entire 2,000-acre Oak Ridge footprint, arguing that the illegal destruction of Martha's trees was an integral, premeditated part of the larger development project. "Do you know what this means?" Croft demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "It means the title to our land is clouded. We can't sell a single subdivided lot. We can't secure our Phase 2 construction loans. No bank on Wall Street is going to underwrite a project with an $81 million cloud hanging over it." She just froze the entire project. By the time Croft reached his glass-walled corner office in downtown Seattle, the financial hemorrhage had already begun. The lead institutional investor for the summit was Prescott Capital Management, a New York private equity firm managed by a notoriously risk-averse man named Thomas Rigsby. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Rigsby was on a conference call with Croft and Oak Ridge's lead defense attorney, a $1,500 an hour corporate litigator named Jonathan Mercer. "Harrison," Rigsby's voice crackled through the speakerphone, cold and detached. "I'm looking at a Bloomberg terminal alert stating Oak Ridge Capital is facing a willful destruction of property suit that exceeds your total liquid assets. Please tell me why my compliance department is advising me to freeze your $70 million draw for the clubhouse construction." "Thomas, it's a frivolous claim." Croft lied smoothly, adjusting his tie. "An independent contractor made a navigational error in the dark. It's an insurance matter. We are filing a motion to dismiss the Oak Ridge entity from the suit today. The widow is just trying to extort a higher buyout." Mercer, the defense attorney, steepled his fingers. "Mr. Rigsby, I am reviewing the filings. Oregon's ORS 105.810 is a strict liability statute, meaning whoever cut the trees is liable. But to get the triple damages, the $80 million, they have to prove it was willful. They have to prove Oak Ridge ordered the contractor to do it. They can't prove that. There is no paper trail." "There better not be," Rigsby warned, "because if our fund gets dragged into a multi-million-dollar punitive damages lawsuit over some stolen fruit trees, we won't just pull our funding. We will liquidate your firm to recoup our initial equity. Fix this, Harrison. Now." When the call ended, Mercer turned to Croft, his expression grim. "Harrison, I need to know right now. Did you order Billy Garrison to clear that orchard?" Croft looked at Boyle, then back at his lawyer. "We told Garrison the land needed to be cleared. If he crossed a property line, that's on him. We have a signed indemnity clause in his contract." "Good," Mercer said, standing up. We isolate Garrison. We let him take the fall. We claim he went rogue to finish the job early and collect a performance bonus. If we can prove Garrison acted independently, the triple damages claim against Oak Ridge collapses, the alias pendens gets lifted, and we settle with the widow for whatever her firewood is worth. But down in the Willamette Valley, Martha Linwood wasn't thinking about firewood. She was thinking about digital footprints. Legal discovery is a brutal, exhaustive process. It is the phase of a lawsuit where both sides are legally compelled to hand over emails, text messages, internal memos, and contracts. Jonathan Mercer played the discovery game exactly as David Caldwell expected he would. Mercer dumped 200,000 pages of irrelevant Oak Ridge corporate emails on Caldwell's desk, a tactic known as a document dump, designed to drown the plaintiff in useless paperwork and drain their legal funds. Mercer also produced the contract with Garrison Earthworks, pointing out the indemnity clause that explicitly forbade Garrison from trespassing on non-Oak Ridge land. On paper, Oak Ridge looked clean. Richard Boyle had been smart enough not to put an assassination order on Martha's orchard in an email. But Caldwell and Martha were playing a much deeper game. They didn't care about Oak Ridge's emails. They cared about the machines. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, Richard Boyle was summoned to a sterile conference room in Portland for his sworn deposition. Boyle sat casually, sipping sparkling water, wearing a tailored navy suit. He projected the aura of a man entirely unbothered by the proceedings. Across the table, Caldwell sat beside a court reporter, with Martha Linwood seated quietly in the corner, knitting a thick wool sweater. "Mr. Boyle," Caldwell began, adjusting his glasses, "could you describe for the record how Billy Garrison's crew managed to accidentally bulldoze 40 acres of my client's land?" Boyle offered a practiced, sympathetic sigh. "As we understand it, Mr. Caldwell, Garrison's foreman was using a digital GPS map on a tablet. It was a moonless night. The terrain is relatively flat. He misread the coordinates, breached a fence he thought was an old cattle line, and began clearing what he believed was our Phase 1 residential footprint. A tragic, negligent mistake." "A mistake," Caldwell repeated. "And Oak Ridge Capital had no prior knowledge that Mr. Garrison intended to cross that property line?" "Absolutely none," Boyle said firmly. "Under penalty of perjury, Oak Ridge gave no such order." Caldwell nodded slowly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at Boyle with a terrifyingly calm expression. "Mr. Boyle, are you familiar with Caterpillar heavy machinery? Specifically, the D8T bulldozer?" Boyle blinked, thrown off by the pivot. "I oversee acquisitions, not construction. I know they are large tractors." "They are indeed," Caldwell said. "A brand new Caterpillar D8T costs roughly $1 million. And because they are million-dollar assets, they come factory-equipped with a proprietary telematics software system called VisionLink. Are you familiar with VisionLink?" Mercer, sitting next to Boyle, suddenly sat up straighter, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Objection. Relevance. My client isn't a mechanic." "I'll allow him to answer if he knows," Caldwell pressed. "I don't know what that is," Boyle said, his voice losing a fraction of its confidence. "Allow me to explain," Caldwell said, opening the folder. VisionLink is essentially a black box for heavy machinery. It tracks fuel consumption, idle time, blade angle, and most importantly, sub-meter GPS positioning. It pings a satellite every 3 seconds. Last week, we subpoenaed the VisionLink data directly from the leasing company that provided those 3 bulldozers to Garrison Earthworks. Martha stopped knitting. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Boyle. Caldwell slid a large, glossy printout across the mahogany table. It was a satellite map of Martha's 40-acre orchard. Overlaid on the map were 3 distinct neon-colored lines, red, blue, and green, representing the exact GPS paths of the 3 bulldozers on the night of the destruction. "This is the telematics data from the night of October 12th, Caldwell said, his voice ringing with cold authority. "If this was an accident, Mr. Boyle, one might expect the machines to wander haphazardly, but look at the red, blue, and green lines. The operators breached the gate, fanned out exactly 100 yards apart, and drove in perfect parallel sweeping grids. They executed a textbook agricultural clearing pattern. They systematically targeted the densest clusters of the Linwood ruby trees, avoiding the empty pastures entirely." Boyle stared at the lines on the paper. The color drained from his face. "Furthermore," Caldwell continued, twisting the knife, "the blade angle data shows they weren't just pushing dirt. They were raising the blades to strike the trunks at the optimal height to snap mature trees, then lowering them to shred the root crowns. This wasn't a navigational error in the dark, Mr. Boyle. This was a highly coordinated, tactical demolition." Mercer slammed his hand on the table. "This proves nothing regarding Oak Ridge's involvement. It only proves Garrison's operators were efficient at their job once they mistakenly entered the property. Doesn't it? Caldwell asked softly. He leaned in toward Boyle. Mr. Boyle, Garrison Earthworks is a small-time outfit. If they made a mistake, they would have realized it after snapping the first tree. But they stayed for 4 hours. Someone paid them a premium to do this in the dark, and my firm has just filed a motion to subpoena the personal bank records of every executive at Oak Ridge Capital, including you, to find the cash withdrawal that funded this hit. Boyle looked at Mercer, sheer panic in his eyes. Mercer quickly intervened. This deposition is over for the day. My client is not answering any more questions. As Boyle scrambled to his feet, desperate to leave the room, Martha Linwood finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the room completely. You can run back to Seattle, Mr. Boyle, Martha said, picking her knitting needles back up. But Arthur's trees were in this valley long before you got here, and I promise you, I will make sure their roots are wrapped around your neck before you leave. The walls were rapidly closing in on Oak Ridge Capital. The telematics data had demolished the accident narrative in the eyes of the presiding judge, who immediately denied Oak Ridge's motion to dismiss the lawsuit. The case was headed for a jury trial in Oregon State Court, a venue famously hostile to out-of-state corporate developers. Behind closed doors, Harrison Croft was in full survival mode. He knew that if Caldwell traced any financial or communication link between Oak Ridge and the contractor, the $81 million judgment would become a reality, triggering immediate bankruptcy. Croft needed to ensure Billy Garrison kept his mouth shut. Garrison Earthworks operated out of a metal warehouse on the outskirts of Eugene. Billy Garrison was a massive, bearded man whose hands were permanently stained with diesel grease. He wasn't a corporate mastermind. He was a guy who moved dirt for a living. When the lawsuit hit, Oak Ridge had promised to cover his legal fees, provided he stuck to the script. But as the weeks dragged on, the Oak Ridge money stopped flowing. Garrison's legal bills were mounting. His heavy machinery was impounded as evidence, and his insurance company had dropped him entirely, citing the intentional nature of the damage revealed by the VisionLink data. He was staring down the barrel of personal ruin. On a frigid Thursday evening, Richard Boyle drove down to Eugene to meet Garrison at a desolate truck stop diner. Boyle slid into the vinyl booth, refusing to take off his cashmere overcoat, and placed a thick manila envelope on the table. There's $50,000 in cash in there, Billy, Boyle said, keeping his voice low. Severance. Oak Ridge is publicly terminating our contract with you tomorrow. We have to distance ourselves. When you get deposed next week, you take the Fifth Amendment. You take the civil hit. You declare bankruptcy. In 2 years, when the dust settles, Harrison will make sure a new LLC gets a very lucrative, unbid contract in Idaho. But you do not mention my name. Garrison looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. He looked at Boyle, his jaw clenching. 50 grand. I'm losing my house, Richard. My business is frozen. I've got guys who haven't been paid in a month. I'm looking at criminal trespassing charges, and you hand me 50 grand and tell me to jump on a grenade for Harrison Croft. It's not a request, Billy, Boyle said coldly. We have the best lawyers in the country. If you try to drag us down with you, we will bury you so deep you won't see daylight. You signed the indemnity clause. You are legally responsible. Take the cash. Boyle stood up, left a $20 bill for the coffee he hadn't touched, and walked out into the rain. Garrison sat alone in the diner for a long time. He looked out the window at his battered pickup truck. He thought about his crew, his reputation, and the sheer arrogance of the man who had just threatened him. Then, he pulled a burner phone from his pocket and dialed a number he had sworn he would never call. The next morning, Billy Garrison walked into the law offices of Caldwell and Wright in Portland. He was flanked by his own overworked defense attorney. David Caldwell and Martha Linwood were waiting for him. Garrison didn't sit down. He paced the floor, looking like a caged bear. I'm not a good guy in this, Mrs. Linwood, Garrison said gruffly, refusing to meet her eyes. I knew what I was doing that night. I knew they were cherry trees. But I have a family. I have a business. Boyle told me if I didn't clear your land, Oak Ridge would blacklist me from every development project on the West Coast. Why are you here, Mr. Garrison? Caldwell asked smoothly. Because they just threw me to the wolves, Garrison spat. Boyle tried to buy me off for 50 grand last night. They want me to take the fall for the whole 80 million. I can't pay that, but I can give you the head of the snake if you drop the damages claim against my company and agree not to pursue my personal assets. I will give you the proof you need to ruin Oak Ridge. Caldwell looked at Martha. She nodded once. If you can prove Oak Ridge ordered the strike, we will focus our collection entirely on them, Caldwell agreed. But it has to be undeniable. Garrison reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a folded, oil-stained piece of heavy-duty plotter paper. He laid it flat on the conference table. It was a topographical map of the Willamette Valley. But it wasn't a standard contractor's map. It was an internal Oak Ridge capital planning document, clearly stamped with the company's logo in the corner. They were careful not to email me, Garrison explained, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the center of the map. Boyle handed this to me physically in a parking garage 2 days before the hit. He told me to destroy it. Caldwell and Martha leaned in. The 40-acre Linwood orchard was circled in thick black Sharpie marker, but that wasn't the smoking gun. In the margins of the map, written in unmistakable blue fountain pen ink, were handwritten instructions. Clear Area 4, Linwood, target large roots, do it at night. $100,000 cash bonus upon completion, burn the wood if possible. R.B. Caldwell stared at the handwriting. It was Richard Boyle's signature. Boyle hadn't just ordered the destruction, he had put a bounty on the trees in writing. Garrison, possessing a blue-collar shrewdness Oak Ridge had vastly underestimated, had kept the map locked in his gun safe as an insurance policy. This, Caldwell breathed, a vicious smile spreading across his face, is the Holy Grail. This proves willful, premeditated malicious destruction, orchestrated directly by an executive officer of Oak Ridge Capital. Martha looked at the map, tracing her finger over the black circle that represented her ruined life. She didn't feel joy, only a cold, righteous, absolute certainty. Mr. Garrison, Martha said quietly, you destroyed my husband's legacy. I will never forgive you for that. But you did the right thing today. David, file the motion. I want Harrison Croft put under oath. 3 days later, Jonathan Mercer was sitting in his Seattle office, preparing a motion to force Garrison's bankruptcy, when his paralegal burst through the door, clutching a legal pad, her face completely pale. Jonathan, she stammered. Caldwell just filed an amended complaint. They aren't just suing for civil damages anymore. Mercer snatched the document from her hands. His eyes scanned the summary, stopping on a newly added section that made his blood run cold. Caldwell had submitted the handwritten map to the district attorney. The civil lawsuit was no longer Oak Ridge's biggest problem. The DA was convening a grand jury. Harrison Croft and Richard Boyle were being investigated for felony criminal conspiracy, extortion, and corporate fraud. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed them completely. The moment David Caldwell handed the oil-stained, handwritten map over to the Marion County District Attorney, the battle ceased to be a mere property dispute. It became a sprawling, multi-agency criminal investigation. The Oregon Department of Justice, notoriously protective of the state's agricultural heritage, did not take kindly to out-of-state billionaires orchestrating midnight sabotage operations on local farmers. Within 48 hours, the DA's office issued a grand jury subpoena for Richard Boyle and Harrison Croft. The news leaked to the financial press by the end of the business day. For Oak Ridge Capital Partners, the reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. In the high-altitude, climate-controlled offices of Prescott Capital Management in Manhattan, Thomas Rigsby sat staring at his Bloomberg terminal. The red ticker tape across the bottom of his screen announced the criminal probe into the primary developer of his flagship West Coast Eco Resort. Rigsby, a man who survived 3 market crashes by possessing zero sentimentality, did not hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed Harrison Croft's direct line. Croft answered on the first ring. "Thomas, listen to me. It's a witch hunt. The DA is an elected official grandstanding for the rural vote. We have Jonathan Mercer handling it. The map is a forgery. Harrison, shut your mouth and listen to me very carefully. Rigsby's voice was as cold as liquid nitrogen. I don't care if the map was drawn by the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. My compliance department just flagged Oak Ridge as a severe reputational liability. You are under criminal investigation for extortion and corporate sabotage. We are a fiduciary fund, Harrison. We don't underwrite felonies. Thomas, you can't pull out now, Croft pleaded, a bead of cold sweat tracing down his spine. The Phase 2 infrastructure is no longer my problem, Rigsby interrupted. Prescott Capital is officially invoking the morality clause in our lending agreement. Ochi, we are freezing the $70 million credit facility, effective immediately. See, we are also filing a breach of fiduciary duty suit against Oak Ridge to reclaim our initial $20 million equity stake. You're done, Harrison. Liquidate your desk. The line went dead. Croft sat in his glass-cornered office, the Seattle rain lashing violently against the window panes. The project was dead. Oak Ridge was insolvent. The $81 million civil suit from Martha Linwood was still hanging over his neck like a guillotine. And now he was facing 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. He needed a scapegoat, and Billy Garrison was no longer an option. Croft pressed the intercom button on his desk. Send Richard Boyle in here, now. 10 minutes later, Boyle walked into the office. The senior acquisitions director looked terrible. His usually perfectly coiffed hair was unkempt, and the bags under his eyes were bruised with exhaustion. He had spent the last 3 days dodging calls from aggressive business reporters. Close the door, Richard, Croft said quietly. Boyle closed the heavy oak door and stood nervously by the conference table. Croft steepled his fingers, adopting a tone of faux paternal concern. Richard, we are in a very precarious position. Rigsby just pulled the funding. The firm is going into receivership, but more importantly, the DA is convening a grand jury over this map Garrison produced. We claim it's a forgery, Boyle said quickly, his voice tight. Garrison forged it to save himself. It's my signature, but anyone can fake a signature. The DA is running forensic handwriting analysis, Richard. They will match the ink pressure. They will pull your credit card receipts from that day to prove you were in Eugene to hand it to him. Croft said, his eyes locking onto Boyle's. You're going to be indicted. Boyle swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. We have Mercer. We fight it. No, Croft corrected softly. You don't understand. Oak Ridge can't survive a protracted criminal trial involving its CEO. The board of directors held an emergency vote this morning. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately, with cause. Boyle froze. What? We are turning over your internal emails to the DA. Croft continued, his voice devoid of all empathy. We are officially stating that you went rogue. You were under intense pressure to secure the Linwood property. You snapped, and you orchestrated the clearing without the knowledge or consent of Oak Ridge executive leadership. You will take a plea deal. You will admit to the sabotage to spare the firm. If you do this quietly, Oak Ridge will quietly set up a blind trust for your family to ensure they are taken care of while you serve your sentence. Boyle stared at the man he had idolized, the man he had broken laws for, realizing with sickening clarity that he was being thrown directly into the incinerator to fuel Croft's escape. You authorized the $100,000 cash bonus, Harrison, Boyle whispered, his hands trembling. You told me to get it done. There is no proof of that, Croft replied with a thin, predatory smile. There is only a map with your handwriting, Richard. Be a professional. Take the fall. Boyle walked out of the office in a daze. He rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage, his mind racing. Croft was right about one thing. The map was a smoking gun, and Boyle's fingerprints were all over it. If he went to trial alone, he would serve a decade in prison, while Croft walked away to start a new firm under a different name. But Croft had made the same fatal error with Boyle that he had made with Martha Linwood. He had underestimated his opponent. Boyle didn't go home. He got into his Range Rover, drove directly to his personal bank branch, and accessed his safe deposit box. From it, he retrieved a small, encrypted USB drive. In the modern corporate world, middle management rarely commits a felony without keeping a receipt. when Croft had authorized the $100,000 cash bonus for Garrison. The money had to come from somewhere. It had been drawn from an Oak Ridge discretionary contingency fund. To authorize a withdrawal of that size in physical cash, the bank required a dual-signature internal authorization form. Boyle had kept the carbon copy. It bore Harrison Croft's unmistakable, notarized signature right next to the memo line that read, "Site remediation, vendor bonus." Boyle drove down Interstate 5, crossing the border into Oregon. He didn't call Jonathan Mercer. He called the one man who had the power to tear Harrison Croft to shreds. 3 hours later, Richard Boyle sat in the conference room of Caldwell and Wright in Portland. David Caldwell sat across from him, looking mildly amused. Martha Linwood was absent. She refused to be in the same room as the man who had ordered the death of her trees. "I want absolute civil immunity, Mr. Caldwell," Boyle said, sliding the USB drive and the original carbon copy of the bank slip across the table. "I want Mrs. Linwood to drop me from the $81 million lawsuit. In exchange, I will testify in open court that Harrison Croft ordered the destruction of the orchard, funded it, and instructed me to execute it. Here is the financial paper trail proving his direct involvement." Caldwell picked up the bank slip. He examined Croft's signature, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. The final nail had just been driven into the coffin. "Mr. Boyle," Caldwell said, tucking the slip into his briefcase, "you have a deal. See you in court." The Marion County Courthouse was a stately, aging building constructed of pale Oregon limestone, smelling perpetually of lemon polish and old paper. The civil trial of Martha Linwood versus Oak Ridge Capital Partners and Harrison Croft began in early March, precisely as the surviving cherry blossoms in the Willamette Valley began to bloom. The trial had attracted national media attention. It was no longer just a local property dispute. It was a referendum on corporate greed versus the American farmer. The courtroom was packed to capacity every day, filled with local agricultural workers, legal scholars, and financial journalists, chronicling the spectacular implosion of Oak Ridge Capital. Martha sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a simple, dark wool suit, her silver hair pulled back into a neat clasp. She sat entirely still, projecting an aura of stoic, unshakable dignity. Across the aisle, Harrison Croft sat next to Jonathan Mercer. Croft looked diminished. The criminal investigation had taken a severe toll on him. His skin was pale, his tailored suits hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogant smirk that usually defined him was completely gone. David Caldwell opened his case with surgical precision. He didn't rely on emotion, he relied on math and agriculture. First, he called Dr. Elias Thorne, a leading forensic arborist from the University of California, Davis. Dr. Thorne methodically walked the jury through the devastation. He projected high-definition photos of the splintered root crowns onto a massive screen. "These were not wild saplings, ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Thorne testified, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "The Linwood ruby was a masterpiece of selective breeding. The vascular cambium, the living tissue of the trees, was violently shredded. The soil structure was so deeply compacted by the 40-ton bulldozers that the land itself will require 3 years of deep tilling remediation before it can even support a new sapling. The destruction was absolute, total, and permanent." Next, Caldwell brought the financial reality into devastating focus. He called Kenji Sato, the chief purchasing officer for a Michelin-starred restaurant group in Tokyo. Sato flew in specifically for the trial. Speaking through an interpreter, Sato explained the economic value of what was lost. "We had an exclusive 10-year futures contract with Mrs. Linwood," Sato testified. "The Linwood ruby is irreplaceable. Its sugar-to-acid ratio cannot be replicated by any other commercial cherry. We paid a 200% premium above market rate for her harvest. When the orchard was destroyed, our company lost millions in projected revenue, and Mrs. Linwood lost the entirety of her international export to income for the next 15 years. We cannot simply buy these trees elsewhere. They no longer exist in commercial quantities." Mercer, the defense attorney, tried desperately to mitigate the damage. During cross-examination, he attempted to paint Martha as a greedy opportunist who was inflating the value of her farm to extort a developer. He argued that the $81.6 million figure was an absurd fiction, a statistical anomaly based on compound interest and hypothetical future yields. But the jury, composed largely of Oregonians who understood the brutal, unforgiving economics of farming, remained cold to Mercer's arguments. They looked at Martha, a widow who had worked the soil for 45 years, and then they looked at Croft, a Seattle billionaire who dealt in paper and concrete. The climax of the trial arrived on the fifth day. Caldwell called his star witness, Richard Boyle. When Boyle walked into the courtroom, Croft's face turned the color of ash. Mercer furiously objected, trying to have Boyle's testimony excluded, but the judge overruled him. Under oath, Boyle systematically dismantled the Oak Ridge defense. He testified about the pressure Croft put on him to clear the land at any cost. He verified his handwriting on the map given to Billy Garrison, and then he authenticated the bank authorization slip. Caldwell projected the slip onto the screen. Site remediation, vendor bonus, $100,000. Mr. Boyle, Caldwell said, stepping away from the podium. Who signed the authorization for the cash used to pay the contractor to bulldoze Mrs. Linwood's orchard in the dead of night? Harrison Croft, Boyle answered clearly, looking directly at the jury. And did Mr. Croft know that this money was specifically being used to commit a timber trespass and destroy patented agricultural property? Yes, Boyle stated. Tay, he told me, and I quote, "Turn her trees into matchsticks. When she has nothing left to sell, she'll take our offer." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Martha closed her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath, maintaining her iron composure. Caldwell's final move was a stroke of theatrical genius. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy Croft's ego on the public record. He called Harrison Croft to the stand as a hostile witness. Croft approached the witness box with forced defiance, buttoning his suit jacket. He was a man used to controlling the narrative, used to dominating boardrooms, but a courtroom is a different kind of battlefield, and Caldwell was a master of the terrain. For 2 hours, Caldwell boxed Croft into corners, confronting him with emails, financial records, and Boyle's damning testimony. Croft grew increasingly agitated, his face flushing red, his answers becoming defensive and clipped. "Mr. Croft," Caldwell said, leaning on the podium, his voice dripping with polite contempt. "You authorized $100,000 in cash to destroy an elderly widow's livelihood because she refused to bow to your development schedule. Is that correct?" "I authorized a site remediation bonus for an independent contractor," Croft snapped, his voice rising. "I did not personally drive a bulldozer. I am running a $200 million real estate firm. I don't micromanage dirt." "But you do micromanage the people who move the dirt," Caldwell fired back. "You saw Mrs. Linwood's property not as a home, not as a lifetime of scientific achievement, but as an annoying obstacle on a spreadsheet. You thought you could just crush her." "It was a 40-acre patch of dirt," Croft yelled, finally losing his temper, the polished veneer cracking to reveal the arrogant monster beneath. He leaned forward, pointing a shaking finger at Caldwell. "You are trying to bankrupt a massive corporate entity over a bunch of stupid trees." "We offered her $2.5 million. She should have taken the money. They were just trees." The courtroom fell dead silent. The echo of Croft's outburst hung in the air. Caldwell looked at the jury. He saw a retired logger in the front row narrow his eyes. He saw a high school biology teacher shake her head in disgust. Caldwell turned back to Croft. "They weren't just trees, Mr. Croft. They were her life, and under the law of this state, you have to pay for them." Caldwell turned his back on Croft and walked to his seat. "No further questions, Your Honor." The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours. In the realm of complex civil litigation, a 4-hour deliberation is incredibly fast. It meant there was no debate about guilt, only a quick consensus on the math. When the foreperson, the retired logger, stood to read the verdict, you could hear a pin drop in the gallery. "On the charge of timber trespass under ORS 105.810. Do you find the defendants, Oak Ridge Capital Partners and Harrison Croft, liable?" "We do, Your Honor." the foreperson read, his voice steady. "And did the jury find that the trespass was committed willfully and intentionally?" "We do, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Please read the damages." The foreperson cleared his throat. "We award the plaintiff compensatory damages for the destruction of the patented agricultural assets and lost international revenue in the amount of $27,200,000. Furthermore, because the act was found to be willful under the statute, those damages are tripled to $81,600,000. Croft slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the mahogany table. Mercer put his head in his hands. "Is there anything else?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson said, looking directly at Croft. "The jury finds the conduct of the defendants to be exceptionally malicious and reprehensible. Therefore, we award the plaintiff an additional $20 million in punitive damages, $101,600,000. It was the largest agricultural tort judgment in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Martha Linwood did not cheer. She did not cry. She simply reached out and squeezed David Caldwell's hand. The debt was settled. The roots had wrapped around Harrison Croft's neck, just as she had promised. The fallout was swift and apocalyptic. Oak Ridge Capital Partners could not post the bond required to appeal the verdict. Less than 48 hours after the judgment, the firm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, triggering a massive liquidation of their assets. Harrison Croft's nightmare was only beginning. The day after the civil verdict, the district attorney officially unsealed the criminal indictments. Croft was arrested at his Seattle penthouse by state police and extradited to Oregon to face felony charges of conspiracy, extortion, and destruction of property. With the civil trial transcripts acting as a roadmap for the prosecution, Croft's high-priced lawyers could do nothing to save him. He was eventually sentenced to 7 years in a medium-security facility. Richard Boyle, true to his plea deal, served 18 months in a white-collar federal camp and was permanently barred from holding an executive position in the real estate industry. Billy Garrison declared bankruptcy and moved to Alaska to work on an oil rig, his reputation in the Pacific Northwest permanently destroyed. But the true poetry of the story lay in the resolution of the land. Oak Ridge Capital owed Martha Linwood over $100 million, but the company only had one major asset left to liquidate to pay the judgment: the 2,000 acres of land surrounding Martha's farm, the very land designated for the summit at Willamette. The bankruptcy court ordered a public auction of the property, but there was a problem. The land was tainted. No developer wanted to touch the site of the most infamous real estate scandal in the state's history. Furthermore, the local zoning board, deeply sympathetic to Martha and outraged by Oak Ridge's actions, abruptly rezoned the entire 2,000 acres strictly for agricultural and conservation use, making it impossible to build a luxury resort there anyway. When the auction day arrived, there was only one bidder. Using the court-awarded judgment as credit, Martha Linwood purchased the entire 2,000-acre Oak Ridge footprint for a fraction of its original price. She legally absorbed the massive property into her own. The island had swallowed the ocean. 5 years later, the Willamette Valley looked very different. The scars of the bulldozers had healed, replaced by the relentless, quiet power of nature and human resilience. Martha Linwood, now 77 years old, stood on the back porch of her farmhouse. She held a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the morning fog roll over the hills. The 40 acres that Oak Ridge had destroyed were no longer a barren wasteland. Using the surviving scion wood she had meticulously saved in her greenhouse, Martha had grafted a new generation of the Linwood ruby. The young saplings, heavily protected by high-tensile fencing and state-of-the-art security, were already chest-high, their leaves a vibrant, healthy green. But the real breathtaking sight lay beyond the original 40 acres. Martha hadn't just replanted her farm, she had expanded it. The 2,000 acres that were supposed to be a playground for billionaires, the golf course, the winery, the luxury estates, had been completely transformed. Martha had partnered with the agricultural department at Oregon State University to turn the Oak Ridge land into the largest, most advanced botanical research and conservation facility in the state. She named it the Arthur Linwood Institute for Agricultural Resilience. Where the grand entrance to the eco-resort was supposed to be, there was now a sprawling network of climate-controlled greenhouses researching drought-resistant rootstocks. Where the clubhouse was planned, a massive orchard of endangered heritage fruit trees had been planted, ensuring their genetic survival for centuries. Martha walked down the steps of her porch, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She walked past the new gates and stopped by the first sapling she had planted after the trial. She reached out, her calloused fingers gently touching a small, pale blossom just beginning to open on the young branch. Harrison Croft had tried to bury her. He thought she was just an old woman standing in the way of progress. Though he didn't understand that when you try to bury a farmer, you are only planting a seed. And from the salted earth of corporate greed, Martha Linwood had cultivated a harvest that would outlive them all. What a spectacular story of absolute poetic justice. Martha Linwood proved that you never underestimate someone with deep roots and the patience to see a harvest through. If you loved watching corporate greed get bulldozed by a brilliant, unyielding farmer, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant revenge story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, true-to-life tales of underdogs who fought back and won. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Martha's shoes? See you in the next one.